I was measuring the old fence line on my own 2 acres when Vivian Halstead, president of the Cedar Hollow Estates Homeowners Association, walked up and told me to get out of her neighborhood. When I told her I owned the land under my boots, she looked me up and down from my mud-caked work boots to my face, gave me a thin little smile, and mailed me a $500 fine for trespass. I figured it was just an ordinary woman drunk on a small amount of power. But 3 days later, the association's own attorney opened the county records, went completely quiet, and asked Vivian one question that killed every sound in that room. If you enjoy stories where an arrogant homeowners association gets flipped upside down by nothing but the truth on paper, subscribe to the channel and stay with me all the way to the end, because the last 5 minutes are the part Vivian never saw coming. My name is Malcolm Booker. I am 47 years old, and for 19 years I managed commercial construction projects, which means I have spent most of my adult life reading plans, checking elevations, and arguing with people who thought a line on a drawing was a suggestion. I know what a survey monument looks like buried under 40 years of leaf litter. I know the difference between a property line and a habit. That matters, because almost everything that happened to me over the next 2 months came down to the difference between those two things, and to a woman who had never once in her life bothered to learn it. I bought the old Holloway place in early spring. 2.3 acres, a 1951 farmhouse with good bones and bad wiring, a rotted barn I planned to take down myself, and a stand of hackberry and old oak along the eastern edge. The land was cheap by the standards of that area for one simple reason: the house needed everything. Roof, plumbing, panel, windows. I did not care. I had spent 2 decades building other people's things, and I wanted, for once, to build something for myself, slowly with my own hands, on ground that belonged to me. The important detail, the detail that everything turns on, is this: my parcel predated Cedar Hollow Estates by more than 30 years. When the developer platted that subdivision in the 1980s, they bought and carved up the farmland to the north and the west of me. My piece was never included, it was never annexed. It is not subject to their covenants, their assessments, their architectural review, or their authority in any form whatsoever. I do not share a single legal thread with that neighborhood, I just happen to sit next to it. I did not walk around announcing that. I am not a man who introduces himself with a deed in his hand. I said good morning to people. I waved at the woman who jogged past with 2 beagles. I let a contractor's truck use my gravel turnaround when the street was blocked. I wanted quiet and a fence and eventually a garden. That was the entire scope of my ambition on that street. The first Saturday in April, I went out early with a metal detector, a can of orange marking paint, and a copy of the old plat map I had pulled from my closing. I was hunting for the original iron pins that marked the corners of my parcel. The northwest corner sat close to the entrance drive of Cedar Hollow, near a big landscaped bed and a stone monument sign, and I wanted to know exactly where that corner was before I spent $9,000 on fence. I found the pin about 20 minutes in, 8 inches down, under a mat of old mulch. Bent, rusted, but there. I cleared it, marked it with a stake and a strip of orange tape, and stood up to check my bearings against the tree line. And that was the first moment something in my stomach turned over, because the pin was not where a reasonable person would have guessed. It sat well east of the tree row that everybody in that neighborhood clearly treated as the boundary, which meant that decorative bed and a chunk of stonework and possibly more were sitting on the wrong side of a line nobody had checked in decades. I was still crouched over that pin with my notebook when a white SUV slowed on the entrance drive, stopped and reversed toward me. The window came down. Then the door opened and a woman in her early 50s got out, sunglasses pushed up into blonde hair, phone already in her hand, wearing the particular expression of somebody who has decided who you are before you speak. She did not ask my name. She did not ask what I was doing. Her first words to me were, "Did maintenance send you out here?" I stood up. I told her politely that nobody sent me. I told her this was my land and I was locating my corner pins before I set a fence. She looked at my boots. She looked at the paint can and the dirt on my knees, and then she looked at my face for a good 2 seconds longer than she needed to, and she said, in a voice pitched to be helpful, "Homeowners in Cedar Hollow don't usually dig in the dirt themselves." I have heard that sentence, or one of its cousins, in 100 variations over 20 years on job sites. The general contractor's client who asks the black man in the field vest to move his car. The inspector who hands the plans to the white kid intern standing next to me. You learn to hear the whole thing underneath the words. So I answered the actual question instead of the insult. I told her I was not a resident of Cedar Hollow at all, that my property was separate, and that the corner I was standing on was mine. And she took that as proof, not as clarification, as proof. Her chin came up. "Then you have no business on this side of the entrance," she said. "This is association property. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." I did not argue. 20 years of dealing with people like her, taught me that arguing on someone else's driveway accomplishes nothing, and that the man who raises his voice is the man who gets described later as aggressive. So I capped my paint, picked up my notebook, told her I would go back to the house. I introduced myself anyway, Malcolm Booker. She did not offer her name. She said, "I'm the president of this association," as if that were a name, and honestly, in her mind, I think it was. But before I walked off, I looked past her at that big stone monument sign, Cedar Hollow Estates, cut into granite, lit at night, ringed with boxwoods and a low decorative wall. And then I looked down at the bent iron pin at my feet with the orange tape fluttering on the stake. And I did the math a project manager does automatically, the rough dead reckoning you do before you ever pull a tape. The distance was wrong, not by inches, by a good deal more than inches. Behind me I heard her phone camera click. She was photographing my truck, my plate. She called after me in that pleasant, carrying voice, "If I have to address this again, I'll handle it formally." I said, "You should," and I meant it more sincerely than she could possibly have understood. 2 days later, on a Monday evening, there was a cream-colored envelope wedged into my storm door with the association's crest printed on the flap, no stamp, hand-delivered. I opened it standing on my own porch, and I read the heading twice, because part of me could not believe an adult woman had actually done it. Violation Norder. Category: unauthorized use of association common property. Description: non-resident individual observed loitering and disturbing landscaping at the western entrance. Remedy demanded: immediate cessation. Assessment: $500 with an additional $100 per subsequent occurrence, plus administrative processing. $500. To a man who had spent that morning pricing out roof decking, $500 was not nothing. But the money was not what got into my chest and sat there. It was one particular sentence near the bottom, that Vivian had clearly written herself, because no attorney on earth would have let it out the door. Persons who are neither residents nor authorized service personnel are not permitted to make use of Cedar Hollow property. Residents or authorized service personnel, those were the only two categories she had for a man like me. Either I lived there, which she had already decided I did not, or somebody had hired me to work there. There was no third box on her form for a man who simply owned the ground he was standing on. I sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold, and I typed one of the most careful emails of my life. I did not accuse her of anything. I did not use the word she was going to accuse me of using later. I laid out 4 facts in 4 short lines. 1. I am not a member of your association and never have been. 2. My parcel is not part of the Cedar Hollow subdivision and is not encumbered by your covenants. 3. An association has no authority to levy a fine against an owner outside its membership. 4. Please provide the recorded plat or legal description identifying the specific area you claim I entered. That 4th line was the only one that mattered. Everything after this point happened because Vivian Halstead could not answer it. She replied herself at 11 at night from her personal address, and she did not attach a single document. She wrote that she had lived in Cedar Hollow for 16 years. She wrote that she had chaired the beautification committee before she was president, that she personally selected the plantings at the western entrance, and that she knew, and I am quoting her from memory, but the phrasing has stayed with me, exactly where Cedar Hollow ends. She wrote that my tone was noted. She wrote that the fine stood, and that if I wished to appeal, I could submit a written request with a $50 filing fee. $50 to ask her to look at a map she refused to open. I read that email 3 times, and somewhere in the 3rd pass, the shape of the thing changed for me. This had stopped being a nuisance. A woman who finds a stranger without checking a boundary is a woman who has probably made other decisions the same way. Bigger decisions, with money attached, with concrete attached. So I pulled my closing file, deed, title commitment, tax parcel card, and the old subdivision plat that had been recorded when Cedar Hollow was created, with my parcel shown along the border as a nixed tract, and I spread it all out under the kitchen light, and I traced the boundary call by call, bearing by bearing, the way I would check a foundation layout before a pour. The written line and the living line did not agree. The plat called for the boundary to run at an angle that cut noticeably east of the tree row. But the tree row and everything the association had built along it ran straight. Somewhere in the last few decades, somebody had looked at a line of old hackberries and a collapsing wire fence and decided that was the property line because it looked like one. Trees are not monuments. A fence a farmer put up in 1962 to keep cattle out of a creek is not a legal boundary, but I did not want to be the man who was certain and wrong, so I called Graham Pike. Graham is 61, licensed for 34 years, and I had used him on 2 commercial jobs where the stakes were high enough that I wanted someone who would tell a client no. He does not speculate, he does not chat. I emailed him the deed, the plat, and photographs of the pin with the tape stretched to the nearest tree. He called me back the next morning at 6:40. He asked me 2 questions, both about the pin, then he was quiet for maybe 8 seconds, which for Graham is a speech. "Malcolm," he said, "don't move anything. Don't pull that stake, don't pull that tape, don't touch another pin if you find one. There's something in here I want to see for myself." Graham could not get out to me for 11 days. Survey season had started and he was booked. 11 days does not sound like much, but Vivian used every one of them. The second notice came on day 4. Same cream envelope, same crest. This one escalated the original $500 to $725, adding a reinspection charge and an administrative processing fee, and it included a new demand in bold text. The recipient was directed to refrain from entering any common area, easement, or landscape zone under association control pending resolution. She had also, and this was the detail that told me she was enjoying herself, attached 3 photographs. The photographs were of me, taken with a long lens from the entrance drive. In one of them I am standing at my own northwest corner with a shovel. In another I am walking along my own tree line with a roll of survey tape over my shoulder. She had hired a private patrol service, one of those companies with a magnetic door sign and an amber light bar, and instructed them to document me. I want to be clear about what that felt like, because it is the part people who have never lived it tend to skip past. It was not fear. I was 47 years old on my own dirt in broad daylight. It was something colder and more tiring than fear. It was the knowledge that a woman with a clipboard and a title had decided I was a suspicious presence, and had begun building a paper record of it, and that if this ever turned into anybody's word against anybody else's, the file would have photographs of the black man with the shovel, and nothing at all about the 16-year board president who never once looked at a map. So I went to see her in person, not to shout, to create a record of my own. The association office was a converted bay in the clubhouse building, glass door, 2 desks, a wall of binders. Vivian was at the round table with 2 other board members, a heavy-set man in a golf shirt and a woman with reading glasses on a chain. She saw me through the glass. She let me stand there for 11 minutes. I timed it because I had already learned what kind of proceeding this was going to be. When she finally waved me in, she did not ask the others to step out. That was deliberate. She wanted witnesses, and she wanted them to see the version of me she had already described to them. "Mr. Booker," she said, "are you here to contest the invoice, or are you here to request a work permit for the neighborhood?" The man in the golf shirt glanced at her. Even he heard it. I said, "I'm here because you've issued 2 fines to a man who is not a member of your association." She laughed. Not a big laugh. A small indulgent one, the kind you give a child who has explained something backward. She said buying a house near Cedar Hollow did not mean a person suddenly owned the neighborhood. She said that people move in from outside all the time and assume the amenities are public, and that it was her job, however unpleasant, to educate them. She used that word, educate. I laid a certified copy of my deed on the table, along with a printout of the recorded plat with my parcel outlined in highlighter. I asked her to read the legal description and the exception language out loud if she wanted, in front of her own board. She did not read it. She did not touch it long enough to read the first line. She slid it back across the table toward me with 2 fingers, the way you return a menu you have no intention of ordering from, and she said, "Our attorney handles this sort of thing if you want to make it a legal matter." I have thought about that sentence a great deal since. She meant it as a threat. She meant, "I have a lawyer, and you are a man in work boots, so consider your position." What she did not understand, could not have understood, because she had never in 16 years been in a room where the documents ran against her, was that she had just handed me the only thing I actually needed. Because a lawyer is a professional. A lawyer's license depends on knowing what the record says. A lawyer, unlike Vivian Halstead, cannot afford to guess. So I picked up my deed, and I put it back in my folder, and I said calmly, "Good, let your attorney read it." She took that as surrender. She said she was glad we had reached understanding. The woman with the reading glasses wrote something down. I walked out into the parking lot, sat in my truck for a minute with the windows down, and understood with real clarity that from the moment Elliot Vance opened that file, this story would no longer belong to Vivian. Graham arrived on a Thursday morning with a helper and $18,000 worth of equipment in the back of a mud-brown pickup. He did not want coffee. He wanted the deed, the plat, the title commitment, and to be left alone. Watching a good surveyor work is like watching a slow argument being constructed. He did not start at my fence. He started miles away at a known control point and worked in. He located the original subdivision monuments at the road intersections, checked them against each other, and only then began chasing my corners. He found the bent pin I had uncovered and a capped iron rod at the southeast, and each one agreed with the record calls. Then he started running the line north. I stood back and I watched flags go into the ground. At the beginning, near the south end, the discrepancy was small, 3 feet, maybe 4 east of the tree row, nothing anybody would ever notice or care about, but the recorded line ran at an angle and the tree row did not, and every 100 feet north that gap opened wider. He set one flag, then a second further out, then a third, and by the third I could see it with my naked eye without any instrument at all, because the third flag was standing in mulch. The true boundary did not run along the tree line, it ran directly through the landscaped entrance of Cedar Hollow Estates. Graham did not say a word about it for 2 more hours. He kept measuring. He tied in every improvement he could find, and there were more than I expected. He shot the low decorative wall that curved along the entrance. He shot the irrigation heads and traced the line back to a valve box. He shot 2 raised planter beds. He shot the edge of the paver walkway that ran from the sidewalk in towards the sign. He shot a small seating area, 2 benches on a concrete pad with a solar lamp post that the association had installed some years back. And he shot the granite monument itself, the sign, footing, and all. When he finally came over to where I was standing, he had a clipboard and the flattest face I have ever seen on a human being. He pointed the wall, the irrigation, the planters, the pavers, the seating pad, and then, last, the monument sign and its foundation. All of that crosses, he said. Some of it is entirely on your side. I asked him if he was sure. He said, I'll check my closure and I'll recompute before I seal anything. But if you're asking me whether Cedar Hollow built over your line, the answer is yes, and it isn't close. I want to describe what that moment actually felt like, because it was not triumph. It was something much stranger and quieter. For 3 weeks a woman had been sending me documents accusing me of trespassing on her property, and the entire time the exact spot where she had stood and told me I did not belong, the spot where she had photographed my truck, was ground I owned. Her association sign was not just near my line, part of it was over it. When she stood in front of that granite and ordered me off, she was standing on my land, telling me to leave my land and charging me money for being there. Every instinct I had wanted to get in the truck and drive to the clubhouse and put that clipboard on her round table. I did not. I did not because I have watched people lose winnable disputes by walking in early with a partial file. A preliminary field measurement is not a sealed survey. An angry man with flags in his hand is a story. A sealed drawing, a recorded plat, a certified deed, and a licensed surveyor's stamp are not a story, they are a wall. That is, I think, the whole difference between Vivian Halstead and me, and it has nothing to do with temperament. She acted first and looked for facts afterward, if at all. I would not act until the facts could stand up in a room without me raising my voice. She had power. I was going to have the record. Only one of those things holds when the lawyers arrive. So I told Graham to take his time and do it right. And I filed a formal written dispute with the association, sent certified mail, return receipt requested, disputing both notices in their entirety and demanding the legal basis for the association's jurisdiction over my parcel. 9 days later, I got a letter from Elliot Vance, attorney at law. The first letter was exactly what you would expect, 2 pages, letterhead, measured and cool. He represented the Cedar Hollow Estates Homeowners Association. His client had documented repeated unauthorized entry onto common property. His client sought voluntary compliance. Continued conduct might necessitate injunctive relief and recovery of fees. He invited me to contact his office. I did not hire a lawyer. I sent Elliot Vance 3 attachments and 1 question. The attachments were my certified deed with the legal description, the recorded subdivision plat showing my parcel as an accepted tract outside the platted lots, and Graham's preliminary boundary sketch with his license number on it and a note that a sealed final was in progress. The question was 1 sentence. I have been told since that it was the single most useful sentence in the whole affair, and it was not clever, it was just specific. Can you point me to the provision that authorizes your client to fine the owner of a parcel that is not subject to the declaration? He did not answer for 2 days. I understand why now. Elliot Vance was 44, with a general practice, and the association was steady, unglamorous, reliable work. A president tells you a non-resident is loitering at the entrance, you send the letter. You do not personally resurvey a subdivision over a $500 assessment. That is not laziness, that is economics. But he had a license, and now there was a stamped drawing in his inbox from a surveyor who had been licensed since before Elliot passed the bar. On the 3rd day, everything about his tone changed. He wrote back and asked for the sealed final survey when it was available. He asked for the name and license number of my surveyor. He asked, and this was the sentence where I knew, whether I would consent to his office independently retaining a surveyor to verify at the association's expense. Then he did the thing Vivian had never done in 16 years. He went to the county himself. I know most of what happened next from Nora Bellamy, who works in the county recorder's office and who I met when I went in to pull certified copies of my own chain of title. Nora is 39, and she has the particular patience of someone who spends her days explaining to furious adults what a meets and bounds description is. When I described what I was dealing with, she pulled the whole file for me without being asked twice, and she remembered Elliot because he had been in the week before, standing at the same counter, working through the same books. He pulled the original subdivision plat. He pulled the developer's dedication, which spelled out exactly what land had been conveyed to the association as common area. He pulled the deeds, and then he pulled the association's own submitted improvement documents from the entrance beautification project because that is where the rot was. Here is what the record showed. Some years earlier, Cedar Hollow decided to upgrade the western entrance. New monument sign with lighting, decorative wall, irrigation, planters, paver walk, and a small seating area. It was Vivian's project. She had chaired the beautification committee, she had championed it at 3 meetings, and she had signed the improvement authorization as committee chair. Her name is on the approval. Her name is on the contractor's scope. And in the whole file there was no boundary survey, not one. There was no request for one, no invoice for one, no note about one. What there was instead was a hand-marked site sketch, and on that sketch the eastern limit of work was described by reference to the existing tree line and the remains of an old wire fence. That is the entire origin of the disaster. A committee chair looked at some trees and a sagging farm fence and decided that was where the property ended because it had always looked like where the property ended, and because nobody in 16 years had ever asked her a question she could not answer with confidence. The association approved it. The contractor built precisely where the association told him to build. The contractor did nothing wrong. He was handed a limit of work and he honored it. But the limit of work was fiction, and once the concrete cured, that fiction had a footing. A $500 assessment issued to a non-member is merely embarrassing. It gets rescinded, somebody apologizes, life continues. What Elliot Vance was now holding was categorically different. If the survey held, his client faced an encroachment onto private land involving permanent improvements, which meant potential claims for trespass and ejectment, the cost of relocating a granite monument and a lit wall, and an irrigation main survey and legal costs on both sides, a governance problem about who authorized construction without a boundary survey and who signed it, and on top of all of it, a documented paper trail of the association fining the actual owner of that land for setting foot on it. That last piece is what turns a boundary problem into a story a jury enjoyed. He called a special meeting of the board and requested my attendance. Vivian, as far as I could tell from the tone of the notice she sent alongside his, still believed the meeting was about me. The boardroom was the clubhouse's larger space, a long table, 8 chairs, a whiteboard nobody had erased properly, and a window unit that rattled. I got there 4 minutes early. Vivian was already at the head of the table with a leather folio and a pen laid across it at a perfect right angle. 5 board members were present, the man in the golf shirt whose name was Dale, the woman with the reading glasses, Patrice, 2 others I had not met, and a young man in his 30s who was, I later learned, the treasurer. Vivian opened by thanking everyone for coming to address, and I remember this exactly, an ongoing compliance matter at the western entrance. She then slid a single sheet of paper across the table to me. It was a settlement offer she had drafted herself. If I would sign an acknowledgement agreeing not to enter association property, and pay a reduced amount of $250, the association would consider the matter closed as a courtesy. She said the word courtesy twice. I did not touch the paper. I left it sitting in front of me for the next 50 minutes, and I think that blank white sheet ended up doing more work in that room than anything I said. Elliot Vance came in 2 minutes later with a banker's box. I had never seen him before. Gray suit, no tie, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the specific tiredness of a man who has spent a weekend on something he did not bill for. He set the box down at the far end of the table, took out 4 stapled sets, and passed them around. Then he said he wanted to begin with some background before addressing the notices, and he asked Vivian a question. Who approved the Western Entrance Improvement Project? Vivian brightened. This was her ground. She said she had chaired the committee, that she had personally overseen the design and the plant selection, that she had negotiated with the contractor and saved the association nearly $4,000, and that the entrance had increased property values throughout the community. Dale nodded along. She was, in that moment, genuinely proud. Elliot let her finish. Then he asked, was a boundary survey performed before construction? And Vivian said the sentence that ended her presidency. She said, we used the association map. The map was perfectly adequate. Elliot asked what the association map showed as the eastern limit of the work. She said the tree line and the old fence, which had always been the boundary. Always according to what? He said. According to everyone, she said. He nodded slowly, and then he opened his stapled set and turned it so the table could see, and he put the recorded subdivision plat down flat. Then, beside it, oriented to the same scale, he laid out Graham Pike's sealed survey. You did not need a license to read it. The plat line ran at an angle. The tree line ran straight, and drawn on the survey in clean black line work were the wall, the irrigation, the planters, the paver walk, the seating pad, and the monument with a bold line running through them and hatching on one side. The room went very quiet. Patrice took her glasses off the chain and put them on. Vivian's composure broke first, and it broke in the direction I expected. She turned to me and said I had hired a surveyor to manufacture a problem. She said that anyone can be paid to draw anything. She said she found it very convenient that this had all appeared after she had issued a violation. Elliot cut her off. He did it without raising his voice, which somehow made it worse. Mr. Booker's surveyor used the same recorded documents the county holds, he said. I pulled them myself on Friday. I have also retained a second licensed surveyor at the association's expense, and I expect his findings to match. Vivian, I need you to stop making legal assertions about this until you have read the file. Then he took his glasses off, and he said the thing I will remember for the rest of my life. Vivian, you fined Mr. Booker for standing on Mr. Booker's land. Nobody spoke. The window unit rattled. The treasurer sat back in his chair and let out a breath. But Elliot was not finished, and this is the part I think Vivian genuinely had not prepared for, because she had been braced for the fine to be a mistake, not for the rest of it. He put one finger down on the survey on the hatched area and he moved it slowly along. And this portion of the Cedar Hollow improvements, he said, is on the other side of that boundary, the wall, the irrigation, the walk, the seating area, and a portion of the monument's foundation. Vivian looked at where his finger was. I watched her do the arithmetic, because that hatched area was not abstract to her. That was the ground she had stood on in April with her sunglasses in her hair, in front of her own granite sign, telling a man in work boots that he had no business on this side of the entrance. I had promised myself I would not gloat, and I did not. I asked one question, and I asked it quietly, because the room was already doing the work. So who's trespassing? Nobody answered. Nobody had to. I have been in a lot of rooms where somebody won an argument by getting louder. This was not one of them. What made that moment land was that there was nothing left to push against. The documents were on the table, and the documents did not care how long Vivian Halstead had lived there. She did not concede. I want to be fair about that, because I think people expect a villain to crumble, and Vivian did not crumble. She fought, and every swing she took made it worse, and she could not perceive that. Her first position was that the discrepancy was minor. Just a little off was her phrase. Elliot asked Graham's figures aloud. The encroachment ranged from roughly 4 feet at the south end to just over 22 feet at the widest, involving somewhere near 400 square feet of permanent improvements. 22 feet is not a little off. 22 feet is a room. Her second position was that the association had maintained that ground for years, mowed it, watered it, planted it, and that surely that counted for something. Elliot explained patiently that adverse possession requires specific elements over a statutory period, that permission or mistake complicates it badly, that the association's own file documented a good faith error rather than a hostile claim, and that no responsible counsel would advise the board to bet a legal battle in a granite monument on that theory against a sealed survey. He also pointed out the obvious problem. The association had spent the last 6 weeks insisting in writing that this exact ground was association common property, which is a very difficult thing to reconcile with the claim that they knew they were using someone else's land. Her third position was that I had never objected before. I answered that one myself. I closed on the property in March. I found the pin in April. I raised it in writing within days. A prior owner's failure to notice an error does not transfer land, and the man who let it slide for 15 years is not me. Her fourth position was the one that told me who she actually was. She said the entrance served the whole community, that hundreds of families enjoyed it, that children had their school photographs taken by that sign, and that I was exploiting a technicality to hurt people who had never done anything to me. A technicality. The recorded legal boundary of my property, established by monuments set before I was born, was a technicality, and a landscaping bed her committee planted 8 years ago on ground that was never hers was a community treasure. That is the entire architecture of her thinking laid out in one sentence. Whatever she wanted was principle. Whatever stopped her was paperwork. Elliot corrected her 4 separate times in that meeting, not cruelly, professionally, which was somehow more humiliating because it was the tone you use with a client who is hurting their own case. Stop characterizing the survey. Stop describing the parcel as common area. Stop telling Mr. Booker what his rights are. Do not send correspondence on this matter without my review. and she grew angrier at him than she ever was at me. I think that was the true injury for her. Not that a man in work boots turned out to own the land. That her lawyer, the one she had invoked at me across the table as a threat, spent the meeting patiently walking her back from every claim she made in front of a board that was watching her do it. 3 days later, the association sent me a proposal, and Vivian's hand was all over it, even though Elliot's name was at the bottom. It offered a license agreement permitting the association to continue using the disputed area in exchange for a payment of $1 per year characterized as a neighborly accommodation, with the existing violation notices to be held in abeyance pending my cooperation. $1 a year, pending my cooperation. I declined. Not because I wanted to demolish that entrance. I never wanted that, and I said so in writing in the very same letter. Tearing out a lit granite monument and an irrigation main would cost the association thousands of dollars. It would take a landmark away from 400 families who had nothing to do with any of this, and it would gain me a strip of grass I had no plans for. I am not a man who burned something down to prove he could. I declined because the offer was built to let Vivian keep her story. Held in abeyance means the fine still exists. It means forever afterward she can say that the association graciously cited Mr. Booker's violations in exchange for cooperation. That framing was worth more to her than the dollar was to me. So I put 3 requirements in writing, and they were as plain as I could make them. First, both violation notices rescinded in full and expunged from the association's records with a written statement that the association lacked jurisdiction over my parcel and that no violation occurred. Second, reimbursement of my reasonable survey costs, which came to $4,180 for Graham's work, because I had only incurred them to disprove an accusation the association never had authority to make. Third, the encroachment resolved through a properly documented recorded instrument negotiated at fair value rather than a handshake and a dollar. Vivian called those 3 requirements extortion. She said it out loud in a board meeting, which is how I know about it. And Elliot Vance told her, in front of the board, that what I had described was the ordinary textbook resolution of a boundary encroachment, that a recorded easement or a small conveyance at appraised value was exactly what any competent counsel would negotiate, and that if she used that word again in relation to a documented owner asserting a recorded boundary, she would be creating an additional problem for the association rather than solving the existing one. That was the second humiliation, and it was worse than the first, because it happened in slow motion over several weeks, her own attorney editing her sentences in public. The board asked for a full accounting, and once they had it, the mood turned in a way Vivian could not steer. What angered them was not the encroachment. Boundary errors happen. Old plats, lost monuments, a fence in the wrong place. Anybody who works in land will tell you it is common. What angered them was the money. The association had paid Elliot Vance's firm to draft demand letters, to open a file, to attend meetings, and to research a jurisdictional question, all in defense of an assessment the association had never had the authority to issue against a man who was not a member. They had paid a private patrol service to photograph a property owner on his own land. And every dollar of that came out of assessments the residents paid, spent to pursue a fight that a single hour with the recorded plat would have prevented. Patrice asked the question that mattered, and Dale asked it again in a louder voice. Had anyone on the board reviewed the boundary before the violations went out, and if not, who had authorized sending them? Vivian had signed both notices alone. Graham delivered the sealed final survey the following week. The association's own verification surveyor reported 8 days after that, and his numbers landed within 1/10 of a foot of Graham's along the whole run. There was now no version of the facts left in which Vivian was right about anything. At the special meeting, Elliot laid out 2 options in plain language. Option A, remove and relocate all encroaching improvements entirely onto association property. He gave a rough for demolition, new footing, monument relocation, wall reconstruction, irrigation rework, and landscape restoration, and the low end of that range was more than $30,000, with the real possibility of the sign never looking the same again. Option B, negotiate with me for a recorded easement or a small strip conveyance at fair appraised value, keeping everything exactly where it stood, with the boundary and the rights documented permanently so that no future board and no future owner of my parcel would ever have to relitigate it. I had already told Elliot privately that I would accept option B on reasonable terms. My goal was never that entrance. My goal was a clean line and an honest record. But I held to my one non-negotiable condition, and I asked Elliot to read it into the minutes. The violation notices had to be voided outright, not waived, not forgiven, not withdrawn as a gesture of goodwill. Voided as improperly issued, with the record stating that the association had no jurisdiction over my parcel and that no violation had occurred. The distinction sounds small. It is not. Waived means I did something and they let it go. Voided means it never should have existed. For 7 weeks, a woman had been building a paper file describing me as an unauthorized person loitering where he did not belong, complete with photographs. If that file stayed in a binder with the word waived on it, then 20 years from now, some future board member pulling old records would see a man who got off. I wanted the record to say the only true thing. I never trespassed, not for a minute. The board voted that night. The notices were voided in full with language on the record. My survey costs were reimbursed at $4,180. Council was directed to negotiate an easement and cost sharing on a formal appraisal, and the treasurer was instructed to prepare a report on legal expenses incurred to date. Vivian sat at the head of the table through all of it and did not speak once. Every decision she had made in that dispute was reversed, in order by the board she had run for 6 years, on motions she was not asked to second. She was not removed at gunpoint. She was not arrested. Nobody dragged her out. Real consequences are rarely that theatrical, and honestly, the real thing was heavier than the theatrical version would have been. What happened to Vivian Halstead is that people stopped believing her. That is the whole punishment, and for a woman who had built an identity out of being the one who knew things, out of 16 years of being the final word on what color a door could be and where a neighborhood ended, it was enormous. Patrice was appointed to handle the negotiation with me instead of the president. Motion started dying for lack of a second. When she stated a fact in a meeting, somebody would ask whether that had been verified, and she would have to say she would check. 6 months later, she did not stand for re-election. The bylaws did not push her out. Arithmetic did. The easement was recorded that autumn. The association paid fair appraised value for the permanent right to keep its wall, its irrigation, its planters, its walkway, its benches, and its granite monument on the 400 and some square feet of my property they had built on by accident. The instrument names me as the owner and them as the party permitted to be there. It is filed at the county. Nora Bellamy handled the recording herself and told me, when she handed me my stamped copy, that she wished more of these got resolved before somebody paid for a lawsuit. In November, I finally built my fence. 6-foot cedar along the road frontage, 4-foot split rail up the eastern line where I wanted to keep the view. New pins, capped and stamped, set by Graham with witness stakes. I did the post holes myself over 3 weekends because I had waited 2 decades to build something on my own dirt, and I was not about to hire that part out. Vivian drove past on a Sunday afternoon while I was setting the last corner post. The white SUV slowed and then it stopped, and I straightened up with a level in my hand and waited. There was no question about maintenance, no instruction to leave. She sat in the driver's seat with the window down, and she looked at the line of new white-capped pins running along the ground where the truth had been the entire time, and she said, "Well, it seems everything got sorted out in the end." I said, "It was always clear. You just never looked at the paperwork." She did not answer that. Her mouth moved slightly, like she had a sentence loaded and decided the cost was too high. Then the window went up and she drove into Cedar Hollow, past the granite sign, over the pavers, alongside the wall her committee built, every foot of which she now had written permission to use. I stood there a while after she was gone with the level in my hand, looking at that monument in the late light. The day I met her, she stood beside that sign and told me I did not belong here. She looked at my boots and my hands and my face and slotted me into the only 2 categories she had, resident or hired help, and when neither one fit, she decided the problem was me. She never once considered a third possibility, which was that the quiet man with the shovel had read the plat and she had not. What she never knew, the whole time she was telling me to get off her property, is that she was standing on the wrong side of the line. Vivian fined me $500 for setting foot on her land. In the end, her own association had to pay for the right to keep standing on mine.